Chapter 1 in The Name of the Wind is filled with world building. We get introduced to the Waystone Inn, Old Cobb, and the story of Tamerlane the Great with the Chandrian and Tinkers. We get introduced to Scrail and Bast and the Innkeeper Coat and even the Penitent King. So there is a ton of world building in Chapter 1, and so I'm excited to start my deep dive here in Chapter 1 as we kind of go in more depth through the world building. Now, I'm starting this deep dive series as somebody who's already read The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Sphere more than once. And so while I'm going through Chapter 1, I am going to reference future chapters in this book, in the second book, potentially in the two novellas, and then, of course, other literature in general, and I'll try to give spoilers before I do that. So there's my spoiler warning. This is a deep dive into The Name of the Wind from a rereader's perspective, from the perspective of someone who's already read the first two novels. At this time, the third is not out. And so, Chapter 1, I think it's so appropriate that the first part of the book really starts with a story, because The Name of the Wind is so much about story and kind of the power of story and how story can be used for power. And so I love that we kind of get this opening. So I will go a bit more line through line at the beginning of this chapter. So let's start by just reading out the first two paragraphs here, which really give us our set and our setting. It was felling night, and the usual crowd had gathered at the Waystone Inn. 5 wasn't much of a crowd, but 5 was as many as the Waystone ever saw these days, times being what they were. Old Cobb was filling his role as storyteller and advice dispensary. The men at the bar sipped their drinks and listened. In the back of the room, a young innkeeper stood out of sight behind the door, smiling as he listened to the details of a familiar story. And so, when I think of this, I really feel like we're getting the beginning of a play, of a theatrical production. And so, in my mind, the prologue, A Silence of 3 Parts, which I did a breakdown of, you should check out that video if you haven't. But the prologue would be read to a dark theater with no light. It would just be this voiceover. And then we would have the light come on and we'd be here in the tavern room of the Waystone Inn. And it would, come open onto this scene, and we would have Old Cobb telling the story. And so here's how the story would start. When he awoke, Tamerlane the Great found himself locked in a high tower. They had taken his sword and stripped him of his tools. Key, coin, and candle were all gone. But that weren't even the worst of it, you see. Cobb paused for effect, 'cause the lamps on the wall were burning blue. Graham, Jake, and Shep nodded to themselves. The three friends had grown up together, listening to Cobb's stories and ignoring his advice. And so, to me, that's such a great opening scene, is we have this, beautiful, rich, wood-toned tavern, and a man sitting at a bar telling the story to his friends. And it's very familiar, very much, a comfortable setting to settle into for a story. We're hearing a story. Now, as far as the world building goes, when I first read Chapter 1, this story is such a placeholder, this story of Tamerlane the Great. I think in my mind, I picture kind of Gandalf the Grey. Now I might think about more like Merlin, but we have this character the story's about. And when I first read this, I don't care about this character or their story very much yet, because I'm not supposed to care much yet. This is the first chapter of a very long book. I'm not invested. Now I'm rereading it. I'm invested. I've read the series multiple times, what's been out of it, and I love the world building, so I care about the characters in the world now. And that's kind of the magic of the Kingkiller Chronicles series for me, is I enjoy the writing so much that the stories really came alive. And then I started caring about the stories so much that when I went back to reread the books, I cared more about things I didn't care about the first time. And that's kind of how we come into some of the theory crafting that goes into this series. And so for me, I want to read this again and ask the questions that I really have, or give the comments I have. When he awoke, that means something to me. Taborlin the Great is able to sleep and wake, which is actually relevant now when it wasn't before. You assume everyone can do that, but I don't know if that's true. So when he awoke, Taborlin the Great found himself locked in a high tower. They had taken his sword and stripped him of his tools. Okay, so who is they? And where is this high tower? So he's locked in a high tower. He awoke there. Was he knocked out? Was he put to sleep? Was he kidnapped? Like, how did he get into this tower? Because we just come in the middle of a story. We come in, it's not a neat beginning. We're walking into the middle of the story, and I don't know what's going on, truthfully. They had taken his sword. Are these good people who had taken the sword? Had he gone mad? Was he locked in this high tower because he was causing destruction? And that's why they've taken his sword and stripped him of his tools. Key, coin, candle were all gone. And then we get, when that weren't even the worst of it, you see, Cobb paused for effect, because the lamps on the wall were burning blue. And so that has an exclamation point next to it. And so that's like a big deal. And we're like, okay, well, now I know that blue flame is associated with the Chandrian, and so that's what comes up next in the story. They do too. Cobb peered closely at the newer, more attentive member of his small audience, the smith's apprentice. Do you know what that meant, boy? Everyone called the smith's apprentice boy, despite the fact that he was a hand taller than anyone there. Small towns being what they are, he would most likely remain boy until his beard filled out or he bloodied someone's nose over the matter. The boy gave a slow nod. The Chandrian. That's right, Cobb said approvingly. The Chandrian. Everyone knows that blue fire is one of their signs. So, the world building here, again in the present day, is we have Graham, Jake, and Shep, who've all grown up with Old Cobb. So, who is telling this story? Old Cobb is telling the story. 3 people have already heard the story so many times. We have one newcomer in here who seems like they're hearing the story from him for like the first time. And so, as far as writing goes, I think this is really nice that the author has it be both very real world. Like, you know, when your friend has a story and maybe you hang out with that friend a lot, so you've heard them tell the story once, twice, a couple times, but someone new is in. And so, like, that's a tale as old as time. There's a Lucy episode, and I love Lucy episode, where that's like the entire plot of the episode. And so, it's a very real world. We have this story being told, familiar to some people, new to others, and then as the reader, you know, the new person, we get to kind of be that person. So I'm in the book now, and they have questions about this story. And so the questions that get asked are really great. I want you to pay attention to this. So we have an interruption. That's right, Cobb said approvingly. The Chandrian. Everyone knows that blue fire is one of their signs. Now he was... Interruption. But how'd they find him? The boy interrupted. And why didn't they kill him when they had the chance? I still have these questions about things that have happened in this story later on, like when Kavoth discovers his troop has been murdered and he's around a campfire and the presumed murderers are there and he approaches, like they're talking to him. Cinder's kind of playing with him a little bit. Why didn't they kill him when they had the chance? Why wasn't he killed if clearly they're fine with murder? You know, why did this happen? And so these questions that the boy has about Taborlin the Great it's hilarious because like it parallels the questions that I still hold, and they're right here on the first page of the first book. I think there's something fun about that. I don't know. Mean? I can't tell. The answer to that, hush now, you'll get all the answers before the end, Jake said. Just let him tell it. No need for all that, Jake, Graham said. Boy's just curious. Drink your drink. And then the next scene here, we have the boy saying that he needs a drink. And so now we get to have, in this theatrical scene, the person who's been standing just off scene listening to the story in the back, the innkeeper, comes out, and he comes out with food. And so he serves some stew and some bread, and he pulls more beer, and it kind of describes the gentlemen eating their meals. And so I like this from, again, that theater standpoint of like, okay, you just brought everyone in the scene together in a very natural way, and then you reinforce the world building with the food. Food always doesn't always. Food can be a great reinforcement of world building, and I feel like the food really fits the setting when I read these books, and it has inspired me to cook certain meals because I will crave that food. Like, I enjoy stew in the winter, and so I've definitely made a stew because of reading this first chapter a couple times. And then, of course, good bread. So stew and bread. No beer for me because of the celiac, but the rest of it I can enjoy. Maybe a cider. So we have some more world building here with the food, which continues on, and I'll kind of always point out that the food sounds really good. Then we have the story coming back. So they pause for food, and old Cobb eats his real quick, and he comes back so he can tell his story. Now Taborlin needed to escape, but when he looked around, he saw his cell had no door, no windows. All around him was nothing but smooth, hard stone. It was a cell no man had ever escaped. But Taborlin knew the names of all things, and so all things were his to command. He said to the stone, break, and the stone broke. The wall tore like a piece of paper, and through that hole Taborlin could see the sky and breathe the sweet spring air. He stepped to the edge, looked down, and without a second thought, he stepped out into the open air. The boy's eyes went wide. He did it. Cobb nodded seriously. So Taborlin fell, but he did not despair, for he knew the name of the wind, and so the wind obeyed him. He spoke to the wind, and it cradled and caressed him. It bore him to the ground, as gentle as a puff of thistledown, and set him on his feet, softly as a mother's kiss. And so now we have this Taborlin the Great character, and we can see that Taborlin the Great does not follow the laws of the universe as like I know them today, and kind of as these people knew them at whatever time this is. But the idea that, you know, a normal person, an everyday person, can't just look at a wall and tell it to break and the result be the wall breaking. And so this person has a type of power. So we have these kind of monkish, wizard-like powers where you have power over the world around you. Because not only could he break the wall, because he knew the name of the wind, so it implies this is kind of someone who knows many things, as our innkeeper is referred to in the prologue. And so this person, this character, knows a lot of things. They're able to manipulate the worlds around them, and because of that, you know, we're telling stories about them. This story is paralleled at the end of term 1 when Kvothe is at the university. And so that's just interesting. So if we think, I'll read it out in a moment, it's almost word for word paralleled with Elodin talking about being locked away in the rookery or the crockery, because we don't know. We think it's because his mind had some type of break from the deep things that they study at the university, because there's a lot of people in the rookery or the crockery. We're shown this in the scene, that there's a lot of people here. What they study is not easy on the mind, and so a lot of people end up needing like help to live, like an assisted living type facility. And we see that Elodin lived there at one point, and not voluntarily, it seems. He was like locked away in a high tower. And so Why are people locked away in high towers? Because they're dangerous to themselves? Because they're dangerous to others? Who finds them dangerous? Who finds, it means there's a type of power. When you're powerful, you're more dangerous. But we don't have all the context for what's going on. And that's why the world building is interesting, because the more you get into the world and the books and the language and the mysteries, the more answers you want. I should say me, the more answers I want. And so Taborlin the Great, really interesting story that we're opening with. I'm going to read the parallel here just so that it's kind of fresh for you. So we're at the end of term 1. It's going to be right here. Ready? You see, once upon a time, Eladin the Great found himself locked in a high tower. He gestured to the room around us. He had been stripped of his tools, his coin, key, and candle. Furthermore, his cell had no door worth mentioning, no window that could be breached. He made dismissive gestures at each of these. Even the name of the wind was hidden from him by the clever machinations of his captors. Eladin got up from the couch and began to pace the room. All around him was nothing but smooth, hard stone. It was a cell no man had ever escaped. He stopped pacing and held up a finger dramatically. But Eladin the Great, he knew the names of all things, and so all things were his to command. He faced the gray wall beside the windows. He said to the stone, "Break," and Eladin trailed off, his head tilting to one side curiously. His eyes narrowed. "Sod me. They changed it," he said quietly to himself. "Huh." He stepped closer to the wall and lay his hand on it. And then he ends up breaking the wall down and talking about the changes in the wall. But it's the exact same story. And then, because of this, later on, Kvothe does something really stupid. Pause for a second and remember what stupid thing Kvothe does when he is up in the room with Master Eladin at the end of the first term, trying to use his cleverness to become his student. And so that part of the story is interesting because Kvothe starts to quote the story of Taborlin the Great. And so Eladin is quoting the story of Taborlin the Great, but it's definitely paralleling like what's happened to him in real life. And then Kvothe quotes the story of Taborlin the Great and then does something stupid. Let's just read it now. That's what this deep dive is for, right? I'm with people who don't mind that I'm going to go on tangents through this book sometimes. So, after he breaks the wall, Kvothe says, "I simply stood, stunned by what I'd just seen. This wasn't sympathy. This wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. All I could think of was the old line from 100 half-remembered stories." And Taborlin the Great said to the stone, "Break," and the stone broke. Eladin wrenched off one of the chair's legs and used it to batter at the tangled green web that stretched across the opening. Parts of it broke easily or flaked away. Where it was thicker, he used the leg of the lever to bend pieces aside. Where it bent or broke, it glimmered bright in the sunlight. More copper, I thought. Veins of copper running through the blocks of stone that made the wall. Eladin dropped the chair leg and ducked through the gap. Through the window, I saw him lean against the white stone railing on the balcony. I followed him outside. As soon as I stepped onto the balcony, the air no longer felt strangely heavy and still. Now, I talked about that air quality in my prologue video, so if you haven't checked that one out yet, make sure that you do. Okay. Skipping just a little bit. I went to stand beside him on the edge of the roof. I knew what my third question had to be. "What do I have to do," I asked, "to study naming under you?" He met my eye calmly, appraising me. "Jump," he said. "Jump off this roof." That's when I realized that all of this had been a test. Eladin had been taking my measure ever since we met. He had a grudging respect for my tenacity, and he had been surprised that I noticed something odd about the air in his room. He was on the verge of accepting me as a student, but he needed more proof of my dedication, a demonstration, a leap of faith. And I stood there, and as I stood there, a piece of story came to mind. So when Taborlin fell, but he did not despair, for he knew the name of the wind, and so the wind obeyed him. It cradled and caressed him. It bore him to the ground as gently as a puff of thistledown. It set him on his feet softly as a mother's kiss. Elodin knew the name of the wind. Still looking him in the eye, I stepped off the edge of the roof. Elodin's expression was marvelous. I have never seen a man so astonished. I spun slightly as I fell, so he stayed in my line of vision. I saw him raise one hand slightly, as if making a belated attempt to grab hold of me. I felt weightless, like I was floating. Then I struck the ground. Not gently. Like a feather settling down. Hard. Like a brick hitting a cobblestone street. I landed on my back with my left arm beneath me. My vision went dark as the back of my head struck the ground and all the air was driven from my body. That was a very stupid thing that Kvothe does. He jumps out the window, the ledge, without the power to safely reach the ground. And so this is interesting because power is definitely one of the major themes in this book, where you have powers, literally, types of power, how power is used, who has power, very much, how is story used as a form of power. And so Kvothe does not have that power. He cannot call the wind to bear himself gently to the ground, but he has heard this story before, and so he does this, and I have further questions that I guess I'll get into a deep dive. I think it's chapter 45 or 46 at the end of term 1 here, where we're in Master Elodin's rooms and this scene happens. So I'll save some of it for then, but I do think that Kvothe's stupidness is not realizing that he would need someone else willing to do that for him. Master Elodin may have cushioned the blow a little bit, that's why he felt weightless for a second, but did not, make it a comfortable landing for him, because that's something you can only do for yourself, in a way. Now we get to that conversation he has with Master Alvaron, the one that's kind of feels kind of like the Greek dialects a little bit, those back and forth conversations about power to reveal, your thoughts on it and advanced thoughts on it. And so it starts to feel a little like that conversation he has walking the gardens with Mayor Alvaron. But here, I think it's so interesting that we have, Kvothe knowing this story he's heard a lot of times, Elodin knowing the same story, and then Old Cobb in the middle of nowhere, interesting. But Old Cobb knows this same story. So this is a story that is told and told and told, and obviously told similarly, but it must be told in different ways as well if this boy who's here listening to the story doesn't really know what's going to happen yet and is asking questions. And so, since this is a book primarily about stories, that's a really central component to the series so far, it's important to ask, who's telling this story? Why is this story told so much that someone in the middle of nowhere and, a person who spent their life traveling and then a master at university all kind of know this same tale? That means this is told by a lot of people. That means story has the power to travel in this society. And so we have this story being told in an inn in the middle of nowhere with a parallel action at the university. Now, more into the parallels after this. And when he got to the ground, we're back in chapter 1 now, with Old Cobb telling the story about Taborlin the Great. And when he got to the ground and felt his side where they had stabbed him, he saw that it weren't hardly a scratch. And so this actually happens to Kvothe twice directly in the books we've read so far. And so feel free to see if you can think about those 2 times before I tell them out. And so the first time it happens to Kvothe is when he is leaving the Aeolian and heading back to the university. he notices that someone's been following him, and he encounters two men who have a dowser, so they have like a sympathy guided way to find him and follow him. And this is going to be a really interesting scene for the deep dive read, because there's a lot of interesting clues and theories out there around that scene and who these people are looking for them, because we assume that it's Ambrose, but is it really? We don't know. So these two men are looking for him. They corner him in an alley where it is described as having like no windows or door, no way to escape, like a stone alley similar to the high tower described in this story. So that's interesting. And he ends up using clever sympathy to escape that in capture. And he is stabbed during the process. And so he thinks it's going to be bad, but he leaves and he's in a state of, shock for like the rest of the night. And then when he finally does check that wound, he is relieved to see it's not as bad as he thought it was. The second time that happens is in The Wise Man's Fear. And this is when he kills the false Rue troop. So on his way back to see Alvaron from his mission out in the Eld, he comes across that fake Rue troop, really big scene there, and he ends up killing them, murdering them. But while he's doing that, he is stabbed, and it's dark, so he doesn't know how bad the wound is. And he talks about multiple times how bad he knows gut wounds are, and so he's relieved when he looks at it and sees that it's not that bad. In both of those instances, I'm pretty sure his cloak kind of saves him, so his tools, and those were gifts, by the way. Fella gave him the cloak that he's wearing the first time, and then Florian gives him the cloak, the shade that he's wearing the second time that helps, protect him. But he was, he's had this experience. So yeah, this is pretty, something that a lot of people can relate to if you think an injury is going to be really bad and then it's not as bad as you think. So a universal feeling. But the parallel here with it being specifically like a gut stabbing or cut and it coming out is just, again, that repetition, that idea that stories do happen in real life and then they become part of stories and stories morph. And I don't have the answers, but I find interesting questions that come up right in this first chapter when it comes to the storytelling and the paralleling later on in the books. I did not care about a lot of this the first time, maybe even the second time I read the series. But again, as I dive into the world, when you restart it, it can be like exciting to read this stuff and be like, wow, these stories really mean so much more now. It's almost like stories mean more in context than they do out of it. Interesting. Now we get a little bit more what you could call foreshadowing, breadcrumbs, paralleling, hiding information in stories next here. Now maybe it was just a piece of luck. Cobb tapped the side of his nose knowingly. Or maybe it had something to do with the amulet he was wearing under his shirt. What amulet? The boy asked eagerly through a mouthful of stew. Old Cobb leaned back on his stool, glad for the chance to elaborate. A few days earlier, Taborlin had met a tinker on the road. And even though Taborlin didn't have much to eat, he shared his dinner with the old man. And so just pausing that the amulet is coming up, and that's the part that I believe gets paralleled later on, because when we hear this, how the amulet works in a moment, we're going to start to think a little bit about a gram, and then also how the Arcanum Gillers act as grams, and so it is kind of a type of amulet. There might be other amulets out in this world, but that's at least one that we can kind of see here. And so they follow up. Right sensible thing to do, Graham said quietly to the boy. Everyone knows. A tinker pays for kindness twice. No, Jake grumbled. Get it right. A tinker's advice pays kindness twice. The innkeeper spoke up for the first time that night. Actually, you're missing more than half, he said, standing in the doorway behind the bar. A tinker's debt is always paid. Once for any simple trade. Twice for freely given aid. Thrice for any insult made. The man at the bar seemed almost surprised to see Coates standing there, because he's kind of an outsider, kind of new. But this really kind of reinforces part of the repeated storytelling and stories changing the more time you hear them. But what does it also show is that each of these people have the quote here about tinkers a little bit differently, but all three of them agree that the point is you're not a jerk to tinkers because it's going to come back and get you. And so they all agree you treat this profession of people, this class of people, you treat tinkers in a kind manner. You treat them with a certain respect, and that's what it is. And so they might have different ways they say it, Coates being the most interesting, the most lyrical. It seems like it has more layers of meaning here where we can glean more information about the tinkers from his version of the poem or quote, and less from theirs. But the key central component rings true through all three. And so I think that play about storytelling and quotes and what they're meant for, if the point of this quote and story is to give you advice on how to treat a person, then we're good. We all got the same outcome. If this quote is to tell us more about the tinkers, well, the other two don't include more information, but this one does. And so that layering of who is the story for and what are you getting out of it, again, comes into play here to me while I read this. Now we have the last part of Old Cobb telling the story of Tamerlane the Great. So I'm going to finish it off here and read this out loud. Old Cobb nodded before he cleared his throat and launched back into the story. Now this amulet was worth a whole bucket of gold royals, but on account of Tamerlane's kindness, the tinker sold it to him for nothing but an iron penny, a copper penny, and a silver penny. It was black as a winter's night and cold as ice to touch, but so long as it was round his neck, Tamerlane would be safe from the harm of evil things, demons and such. And continues on with an interruption. I'd give a good piece for such a thing these days, Shep said darkly. He had drunk most and talked least over the course of the evening. Everyone knew that something bad had happened out on his farm last kindling night, but since they were good friends, they knew better than to press him for the details. At least not this early in the evening, not as sober as they were. Then it gets into a discussion of, so we get the world building side note, this story interrupted by this kind of omniscient tone telling us more about what's going on in this town setting. So we know that what Shep said, and then we get a little bit of like something bad happened, but they're not talking about it. And so who wouldn't, Old Cobb said judiciously, taking a long drink. I didn't know the Chandrian were demons, the boy said. I'd heard. They ain't demons, Jake said firmly. They were the first 6 people to refuse Telu's choice of the path, and he cursed them to wander the corners. Are you telling this story, Jacob Walker? Cobb said sharply, 'cause if you are, I'll just let you get on with it. And so I needed to bring up these interruptions because we have the, I didn't know the Chandrian were demons, the boy said, and then he's about to say what he heard they were, and so we're about to get more information about something that I'm interested in, and he gets cut off. Nope, we don't get that more info. We don't get to know what the boy heard they were. We don't get his version. He's interrupted by Jake, who tells us that they were the first 6 people to refuse Telu's choice of the path. So now we hear the parallel from old Trappist story while Kvothe is in Tarbean. He gets sick, he goes to Trappist, who nurses him back to health, and then when he's getting healthy, one of the other boys asks for a story, and Trappist tells them like the only story he knows, and in that story it's Telu and Canis and Periel, and we get the first 6 people who are cursed to wander, but then we get wander the corners and we get another cutoff, so we don't even get more information about what corners they are forced. Is it the 4 corners of civilization? Is it the corners of Earth and Eld? We don't know. It's just cut off. And then Old Cobb turns back and he says, that's the mystery of the Chandrian, he explained. Where do they come from? Where do they go after they've done their bloody deeds? Are they men who sold their souls, demons, spirits? No one knows. Cobb shot Jake a profoundly disdainful look, though every half-wit claims he knows. And so, again, these are questions as the reader that I have, and that Cobb is telling me, who's telling this story, he's kind of the town authority on this matter. He doesn't know. So he doesn't know where they come from. He doesn't know where they go after they've done their bloody deeds. So he doesn't say murder or killing, by the way. He just says bloody deeds. Like, that could be the cleanup crew. We don't really know. So that's interesting. And then, are they men who sold their souls, demons, spirits? No one knows. So these are unanswered questions in the world building. So these people are telling stories and they don't all know the answers to these questions either. So we have myths and legends and religious texts that don't necessarily spell everything out. Now, this is how the scene would kind of end, in my opinion. We have this. The story fell further into bickering at this point about the nature of the Chandrian, the signs that showed their presence to the wary, and whether the amulet would protect Tamerlane from bandits or mad dogs or falling off a horse. Things were getting heated when the front door banged open. So this is like a new scene to me. The front door bangs open and we get like scene 2 in like act 1 of the play. Before we go into scene 2, I have a theory, a bit of a dark theory. Not that dark. Just, alright, here we go. Book 3 is not out yet, Doors of Stone. I hope it will be, and when it does, I look forward to reading it. But a lot of people talk about that book and say that the author, Patrick Rothfuss, has written himself into a corner because the book has to end with the end of Kvothe's story here, day 3. And I do not make that assumption, especially because of this first story that we come in kind of in the middle of. So we're put in this story, Tamerlane the Great, and then the story is cut off by the door of the inn bursting open. And so I would not be surprised if in book 3 we wake up and Kvothe is telling his story, but that at some point while he's telling his story, the door of the inn bursts open and we have an interruption and we don't get a clean ending to Kvothe telling his story to the chronicler. I don't think it ends with them sipping beers on night 3, reminiscing about this tragedy that Kvothe just told and is going to be a big story. I think we end in a bit more chaos than that. I would not be surprised if the door bangs open to the inn and we have an interruption, just like we do in this first story in the first chapter. And many times throughout the books, we have him telling a story and there are interruptions. He's telling a story in an inn, in a public place, and with a cover story, so people are coming to see the scribe for different reasons. Also, if it's there, we don't have to end that day. Like, the book can keep going into the future after that. Day 1, which is book 1, is not really day 1. We are here on the first day in the story, but as I'm going through these chapter by chapter before Kvothe sits down to tell his tale to the chronicler, we actually have 5 days pass. Kvothe does not tell his story to the chronicler until day 6 in The Name of the Wind. And then he wakes up on day 7 to tell the wise man's fear. So we have a nice little day 6, day 7 as the first 2 books of the series, sorry. But yeah, that's one kind of bigger point as I have is day 1 is multiple days, or book 1 is multiple days. The story that we start with in the frame narrative does get interrupted, and then the story Kvothe is telling gets interrupted multiple times on day 1 and day 2 of storytelling. I would not be surprised if there was an interruption on day 3 and we might not get to sit down and finish the story, and that's where the book kind of takes us. We will hopefully see. I would love to kind of check out that theory. Okay, the next part of chapter 1 here is the interruption of the men at the inn by Carter entering, and he is in a state of distress. So Carter, the door bangs open, he enters the inn, and everyone kind of assumes once they see him with some blood and some like clear signs of a struggle, they like all assume he was jumped, because that is what is going on at this time in the book, in the stories. People, the roads aren't good. When the roads aren't good, a lot of times that is theft and robbery. And so the almost assumption is that he was jumped. And so Old Cobb's kind of scolding him for going out on his own. And then he's getting annoyed because that's not what happened. Relatable feeling, getting scolded for something and you just wait for them to peter out so you can say, that's not what happened. And then he unveils the Scrael. And so it's this large spider-looking creature with feet like knives. It is described as having grit, like the innkeeper pokes at it, like removes a piece of it, and it's described as having squishy gray innards like a mushroom. And so there's no blood in this creature. And so the townspeople kind of start to come to one conclusion in their head, but the innkeeper, Coach, kind of comes to another because he knows what this thing is. And so here we are. They can't have made it this far west yet, he said softly. Jake found his voice first. You know what this is? The innkeeper's eyes were distant. Scrael, he said distractedly. I thought the mountains. And so he's kind of distracted. He's letting these townspeople know that it's Scrael because he's really thinking about it. And then, Scrael? Jake broke in. Blackened body of God, Coat, you've seen these things before? And so he comes up with kind of a quick story like, oh yeah, the trader that came through 2 weeks ago was talking about them and I didn't think they would make it this far. And so then we get an interruption with Old Cobb coming in. I think it's Old Cobb coming in to talk some smack about that trader because the trader was overcharging significantly for basic goods, salt and sugar, and then even the more luxury goods that people might want that he didn't have. There was no like coffee or cinnamon or chocolate. So another bit of world building. We know that things are not good when traders and merchants are coming through and they're overcharging for the basic goods that people need for everyday living, and they are not even making available the treats that we all really like. So we have a sign of the times not being so great here, built right into the world building and storytelling without it feeling jarring or anything like that. Like, and there was a war. Like, we get it. There's conflict going on. Things aren't going very well. And so after that, we get the kind of all the attention coming on to the Scrael. And so he knows it's a Scrael. The townspeople think it's a demon. And we learn that there are, ways to test if something is a demon. Not that anyone would ever think they had to use this as a test. This is like in stories only, but in the stories, they were told how to treat this thing, and so they get iron and press it into it, and the iron does cause like a reaction. I'll read the smell that the iron does, because smells are relevant in the book. Not something I noticed the first or few times that I read through, but from reading theories on Reddit, there's different people who talk about different smells being associated with different things. So on this deep read, I do want to pay a little bit more attention to some of the smells and scents. So here we go. Ugh. Coat pressed the iron shim to the backside of the creature, and there was a short, sharp, crackling sound, like a pine log snapping in a hot fire. Everyone startled, then relaxed, when the black thing remained motionless. Cobb and the others exchanged shaky smiles, like boys spooked by a ghost story. Their smiles went sour as the room filled with the sweet, acrid smell of rotting flowers and burning hair. The innkeeper pressed the shim onto the table with a sharp click. Well, he said, brushing his hands against his apron, I guess that settles that. What do we do now? And then we have a fade to black. So we really do have like a line across the page here. That's the end of a paragraph, but also kind of the end of a section of chapter 1, which is a very long chapter, which is why this is a very long video. Chapter 1 is long, chapter 2 is short. I'm going to just vary my videos to kind of meet the chapter length because that seems most appropriate, but I'm new, so if you have other advice on how you want this series done, feel free to chime in and let me know. I would happily read some different opinions, considerations, techniques, approaches. But we have this fade to black here, and so what do we do now is how that ends, and then if this were the play, we would have the fade to black, and then we would have the stage workers come in their dark dress, and they would take the scrael away, and the actors would all leave, except for the innkeeper Coat, who would stay there. And then the scene would open with Coat standing in the doorway of the inn now, the inn all nice and cleaned up. It's hours later, and we would have him doing this scene where he's cleaning up the Waystone Inn. So he's like polishing the bottles, sweeping the floor, kind of that very basic, I think super popular cleaning videos now. It would be a little cleaning montage. And the voiceover would be this paragraph from the book, just like reading over, narrating while he does this cleanup and gets ready to walk up the stairs to go to bed. Or to go upstairs to his bedroom. He called himself Coat. He had chosen the name carefully when he came to this place. He had taken a new name for most of the usual reasons, and for a few unusual ones as well, not the least of which was the fact that names were important to him. And that would just be the voiceover, that little part there. Now, it's nice to note that the author highlights that when Coat, we still know him as Coat here. When Coat is looking outside the door of his inn, that he is looking up at a night with no moon. And since we know the phases of the moon are really important for being able to traverse between mortal and fae, I just want to mention that here we are in the frame narrative. In 5 days from now, Coat will be telling his story to the Quoth will be telling his story to the chronicler, but here we are, so it'll be 5 days past a night with no moon. So we'll be having some bit of a moon come back in by the time he is sitting down to tell his story. And so after that kind of little montage, cleaning up the inn, heading up the stairs, in my theater version, the first floor would fade to dark, and the second floor would have a light come on, and we would have a Coat in his room, his bedroom at the inn that he owns, the Waystone Inn. And it's a austere and monkish bedroom, so we don't have a whole lot going on. There is a black stone fireplace in the center of the room, a pair of chairs, and a small desk. The only other furniture was a narrow bed with a large dark chest at its foot. Nothing decorated the walls or covered the wooden floor. Now, I mentioned in the prologue that the third silence has a very wooden quality to me, like the silence is occurring in all different forms of wood. And so here, having nothing decorating the walls or covering the wooden floor is more interesting to me because I wonder if it relates to the silence, which with its very tangible qualities feels almost like a type of influence, like a naming influence or a spell influence or a glamour or something that we don't want to cover because it's like already a thing. I don't know. These are speculations, but that's how I feel when I read this. I don't think it's just setting the tone of he's not the type to decorate. I think there's a greater reason for the floor to be bare. All right. Next is going to enter Bast. So we have our next character enter who has a interesting relationship with the innkeeper Coat. He refers to him as Reshi, and then his name is Bast. And so this next part, we're going to get a little bit into their relationship and conversation as kind of probably the last scene that we're going to have here in chapter 1. So I'll take a pause, go make a fresh cup of tea, And I'll be back in a moment to close out this deep dive into the first chapter of The Name of the Wind. I hope you are enjoying it so far. If you are, I'm a new channel. If you can subscribe, and I'll be back in a moment. I am back, and we are going to introduce Bast. There were footsteps in the hall, and a young man stepped into the room carrying a bowl of stew that steamed and smelled of pepper. He was dark and charming, with a quick smile and cunning eyes. "You haven't been this late in a span of days," he said as he handed over the bowl. "There must have been good stories tonight, Reshi." Reshi was another of the innkeeper's names, a nickname almost. The sound of it tugged one corner of his mouth into a wry smile as he sank into the deep chair in front of the fire. "So what did you learn today, Bast?" "Today, master, I learned why great lovers have better eyesight than great scholars." And then we get into this back and forth with Bast and his apparent student, or Coat and his apparent student Bast, about the nature of indoor light versus outdoor light and the distraction of pretty women versus books. And they get it back and forth, and then Coat lets him know about the scrael that they had, that Carter brought a scrael in tonight. And Bast changed from like a back and forth to like deep concern. He's like, "What?" And so he knows this is a big deal. He assumes that there was like more death and destruction than there was. And so when Coat explains to him, no, like everyone got really lucky. The only thing that died was Carter's horse Nellie, which I still feel terrible about personally. But that it wasn't like the terrible deal that it could have been. And so then they talk about the body. So first was the attack, the scrael, this spider creature with knives for feet, didn't kill a person here, but now the concern comes for like, well, what did they do with the body? And so Coat says to him, "I didn't do anything with it," Coat said pointedly. "I am just an innkeeper. This sort of thing is quite beyond me." "Reshi, you can't let them muddle through this on their own." Coat sighed. "They took it to the priest. He did all the right things for all the wrong reasons." Bast opened his mouth, but Coat continued before he could say anything. "Yes, I made sure the pit was deep enough. Yes, I made sure there was rowan wood in the fire. Yes, I made sure it burned long and hot before they buried it. And yes, I made sure that no one kept a piece of it as a souvenir." Because he did keep a piece of it, but not as a souvenir, so I guess he wasn't technically lying here. He scowled, his eyebrows drawing together. "I'm not an idiot, you know." And so this part, I think, really parallels earlier, where we had multiple people talk about the Tinkers. They had different takes on the saying, but they knew the takeaway was you treat the Tinker with kindness, and then the implications were or else. Here we have you treat the demon, and whatever it is that Coat and Bast would call it, with this specific kind of ritual of actions. And so the priest is doing it because this is what the stories of the church tell you to do. And then Coat and Bast would do it because that's what they know from knowledge from other sources what to do. And so the knowledge is important enough that different mediums are kind of passing it to the people. So that way something important is treated the proper way, whether it's you're doing it because the priest tells you to, or because someone from the Fae tells you to, or life knowledge. However, this knowledge is being put to multiple people. So to me, that means it is important and we have to get it out to a lot of people. And so it's talking more about the power of story. And one thing that churches can do is, publish stories and texts and pass them around to a lot of different people because they gather regularly to talk about things. So what other groups gather regularly to talk about things? What other groups of people pass through towns to tell stories? How else are stories remembered? What if we put them to music? And so just here, the idea of story really comes through a lot more to me as it does in other areas of this book, and how important story is so that things are done in whatever way the person writing them thinks is the right way. Okay, some people agree, some will disagree. We get more of the relationship between Bast and Reshi and how they talk about kind of what's going on in the town. And then we finally get Coat, Reshi, both dismissing Bast, telling him to all right, go away so I can eat my food and go to sleep. And this is really interesting because he says to him, "Begone, demon," Coat said. switching to a thickly accented Temic through half a mouthful of stew. Tehus and Tausa Eha, so he's speaking a different language. Bast burst into a startled laughter and made an obscene gesture with one hand. Coat swallowed and changed languages. Ori te Dena Leyen. We don't know what language that is, but it is the first time Dena is brought up in these books. Technically, not as her character, but Denna right there in an unknown language, because the author doesn't tell us when he switches from Temic to another language what language it is. But there is her name in there, and Bast responds, "Oh, come now," Bast reproached, his smile falling away. "That's just insulting." So interesting. "By earth and stone I abjure you." Coat dipped his fingers into the cup by his side and flicked droplets casually in Bast's direction. "Glamour be banished." And so now I have a quick pause to say that I first read these books back in 2011, reread them many times, and then 2023 was actually the first time I looked to outside sources on their theories, and I wasn't looking. I just love YouTube. I watch a lot of YouTube. I'll give a lot of YouTube recommendations. The first one here is Captured in Words. If you're on this video, I feel like you've probably seen his theory videos on the King Killer Chronicle already. They are lovely. I was so excited. Like I said, I went through my YouTube history to look at when the first time I watched one of his videos was, and it was 2023. It was his summary of The Name of the Wind, part 1. I've done a summary of The Name of the Wind for fun, partly because of how much I enjoyed that one, that I wanted more of them to be out there. And so that was the first time I've heard someone talk more about outside sources, and I guess that Rothfuss, the author of these books, has confirmed that glamour is another type of magic that the Fae use to move around among the mortals. And we do know Florian references this magic a bit when she says, that they can move around the mortal realm, just sacrificing some of their power, but she doesn't necessarily talk about the glamour itself directly, and so here we have, glamour be banished. So I don't know if that name of magic comes up in the books, but it does kind of in the greater knowledge of the world, and here it is back in chapter 1, before we even know that Bast is, really one of the Fae creatures. So that's kind of fun and cool. After that, they talk a little bit more about their books, and then we have Bast exiting the scene, and we have the scene ending here with Coat alone in his room, in his kind of monkish room. And I just think it's interesting if we think about the Waystone Inn not just as a place that he's hiding out, but as potentially a place that he's home aloning, kind of maybe trapping the house for defense or offensive purposes. If so, if you're a sympathist, we know that you need your tools, and we know that one of the greatest tools of a sympathist is fire and access to heat. We know that Kilvin has a way to manage the heat during the fishery fire. He uses that heat eater to kind of get rid of it. We know that Devi uses a poor boy to explode kind of some heat out for her to use as a source very quickly and in an important way. And so we know that the manipulation of heat is something sympathists think about a lot. And so here, in his room, alone, by himself, his eyes wandered the room restlessly. The fireplace was made of the same black rock as the one downstairs, so we're increasing that link between them. It stood in the center of the room, a minor feat of engineering of which Coat was rather proud. So this is very intentional. He had to really work to get this in the center of his room, and he's proud of it. Feels important. Now, what doesn't feel important? The bed was small, little more than a cot, and if you were to touch it, you would find the mattress almost non-existent. This man could have any kind of bed he wants, it seems. We read down a little bit further, and we talk about how expensive the chest at the foot of the bed is. This is a choice. You're choosing not to make your bed super comfortable and cozy. And because of the doors in the mind and sleep and its relationship with the Chandrian, I just find this very interesting. And I think it's a little sprinkle of what's going on here? Why is his bed not as important to him as other things? Now, about that chest, it was made of roa, a rare heavy wood, dark as coal and smooth as polished glass. Prized by perfumers and alchemists, a piece the size of your thumb was easily worth gold. To have a chest made of it went far beyond extravagance. So this is a very expensive chest, and it's also a very mysterious chest because the chest was sealed 3 times. It had a lock of iron, a lock of copper, and a lock that could not be seen. Tonight the wood filled the room with an almost imperceptible aroma of citrus and quenching iron. That's interesting because I learned in those same videos that didn't pick this up on my own, but that copper does have kind of a deadening quality, either on sympathy or naming or other magic or all magic. I don't know the details, but we read earlier about Elodin's rooms, them adding kind of copper into the walls, and then here we have a copper lock. So we have this kind of interesting, I think he had a copper key earlier in the door, and so we're going to pay more attention to the metals and the scents as we go through the deep dive here. So we had a lock of iron, copper, and one that can't be seen, and since the chest has an aroma of citrus and quenching iron, other people who have done theories have pointed out that the lockless box and the tree that the Cathay is kind of trapped in have similar scents to them, and so that's really interesting. When I mention theories from things like Captured in Words or Reddit or things like that, if it's a really big theory that kind of made me be like, oh my goodness, I'll link it in the comments underneath so that you can check it out. When it's something I just read from multiple people or quite a while ago that's been floating around, I'm just going to say it, and then if we need to link something we can, but this is one that I didn't come up with on my own or anything, but I have read and heard and found interesting, and I want to be able to include that stuff. So that's how I plan to handle it. I hope that works out well for everyone. Now we just have the very end of the scene. Once in bed, it was a long time before he slept, and so just interesting with the silence and the sleep coming in. You would think that would be the end of chapter 1, but we have just a little bit more here. That is the end of day 1 in the beginning of the book, but day 2, as Coat had guessed, they came back to the Waystone the next night for dinner and drinks. There were a few half-hearted attempts at stories, but they died out quickly. No one was really in the mood. So storytelling, not so much, but they do end up talking about what's going on in the world. So they chewed over the rumors that had come into town, most of them troubling the penitent king, someone who I don't know who that is, but there are theories around and I want to pay more attention to what's going on in the leadership. The penitent king was having a difficult time with rebels in Resbeck. This caused some concern, but only in a general way. And then we have Cobb predicting a 3rd levy of taxes after the harvest we're in. So we know that times that are already rough there's not relief coming. There's war going on, there's rebels, there's a 3rd levy, high taxes, it's not oh, okay, things are about to change and get all better. We're in a rough time and we have no end in sight. Then we have them complaining about the roads. Over the last 2 months, the roads had become so bad that people had stopped complaining. And so it's supposed to be this darker tone going down. And then the last point here that's interesting is the people who are in the Waystone Inn, who were there the night before when they were interrupted by Carter in the Scrael. The rumors are going around the town about what happened, but since demons aren't real, they're just things in the story and that the priests think about and you talk about at church, but they don't show up in your town. Because of that, these guys aren't trying to convince everyone of their story. They just went to the smith to buy a bar of iron because that's what you beat and fight the demons away with, and they're living their lives knowing they saw what they saw, and that is what it is. And so the conversation took a downward turn from there. And even though none of them said what they were thinking, the evening ended on a grim note. Most evenings did these days, times being what they were. We have the little literary tie-in here. Times being what they were is the last line of the last sentence of the first chapter. And then if we go back to the very beginning of the chapter, the first paragraph ends with times being what they were. Because it says, 5 wasn't much of a crowd, but 5 was as many as the Waystone Inn ever saw these days, times being what they were. So we had this nice literary tie-in of times being what they were, times being what they were, and in between it, just a ton of world building, just so much world building going on that I'm excited to get into chapter 2, where things kind of switch up a little bit. Chapter 2, so much shorter. The first chapter here is like a good 16 pages of like dense text. Chapter 2 is about like 3 pages, so it really do get a little variety in page length. Chapter 1 being one of the longer chapters and a lot going on, so that's why I read a lot more line by line, because it feels like it sets us up for the next phases into this deep dive. I had mentioned earlier in the chapter, oh, that's right. On a personal note here, outside of the series, I am currently reading The Once and Future King. I talked about this a little in my prologue video, and I'm reading it because I do see parallels of it with this book, and so I was sick of looking at like summaries and stuff, and I just wanted to read it. Reading it, I'm really enjoying it more than I thought I would, but I had a Kingkiller Chronicle moment, or a, universal moment of 2 different versions of a book causing some confusion. So in The Once and Future King, it is 4 books that T.H. White put together. And so The Sword and the Stone is the first book in the larger series, and they get put together into one book. When he was editing the 4 series into the larger compilation, he took out one story where Merlin rescues the Wart and Kay, and then 2 other like creatures that are being kept from a witch's cottage in the wood, and there's this big battle scene that goes back and forth. I have the text book, the ebook that I'm reading on my Kindle, and I also have a different file for the audiobook that I was listening to because I've been walking more in the morning, and it's been nice to be able to listen to the book while I'm walking and then sit down and read it later. So I read it, I was out walking, and I hear the story, and I was like, oh man, I want to go back and read this scene because I think that there's certain things I'll get out of reading it more slowly. So I turn off the audiobook and I come in to go read it, and it's not there. It's like the beginning of the scene, Wart shoots his arrow up, and then the next chapter starts where they talk about jousting, but that whole battle scene was gone. And so we looked it up because Mr. Glasses is reading these with me right now. We're both reading them, and looked it up and found out that T.H. White took that story out when he put the 4 books together because he didn't feel like it fit with the greater like anti-war theme. So it's in The Sword and the Stone, but it's not in there when you put the books together. So the audiobook narrator must be reading, like either chose to put it back in or is reading from The Sword and the Stone for the first one and then we'll switch. I'm not sure exactly what happened with that, but it was really funny to have something you listen to and then you go to look for it and it's not in the book, and how frustrating that was. When I have access to the internet, I can go and find that little blurb within like minutes. Kavoth feeling like there's something missing from text or different in text and having to like travel from city to city and town to town to like solve this mystery it was a moment of like empathy and also like privilege of realizing like how much access to information I really have, that like I can solve this mystery pretty quickly of why it was like this and also like find the missing part so that I can read it. And so that was my just little personal experience with a similar theme in the Kingkiller Chronicle, in The Name of the Wind, kind of popping out into my real life, and I thought that was fun. I hope that you enjoyed this deep dive into Chapter 1 and that you will subscribe and join me as I continue on. The next video up is going to be Chapter 2. I'll see you there.